Thank you very much for joining me in my little backstage studio here.
Thanks for having me.
Maybe we dive right into the interview by you introducing yourself. What is your role and
Okay, I'm Jeff DeGraff. I'm a professor at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. I'm the founder of the Innovatorium Institute for Innovation, which has labs in Ann Arbor, Detroit, and Atlanta, and we serve about half of the Fortune 500 on a pretty regular basis. I write a lot of books. I have an NPR program called The Next Idea, and I travel far too much, far more than a decent person should travel. That's who I am.
Now I'm going to start with a big question, and not easy to answer, I think, but you can pick out the part that you want to answer. Is like, what is the primary challenge of when you're talking about innovation and then large companies?
Well, it's threefold, I think. I think there's three big issues. The first one is, what do you mean by innovation? Because a lot of times what they mean is hard, lumpy objects. They mean tech. I work mostly with CEOs and chief operating officers, and what they mean is revenue. They don't care whether it's aerospace or tangerines, right? It's making money. And there's kind of with younger people, it's sort of the cool factor. So the first thing is, what exactly are we trying to do here? And that's going to determine largely how we do things, because these are not the same. They're not simpatico. The second problem, when we talk to large organizations and sort of what's the challenge of innovation, is they get stuck in the planning cycle. They plan, they go to the meeting about the meeting, the report about the report, and they wait, and they assume that at some point all that planning is going to pay off, when really the key is getting momentum. Can you get momentum in a large organization? And I think the final one is, almost always large organizations have the amazing ability to innovate, but what they don't have the ability to do is to collaborate across boundaries. They have real trouble connecting the dots, right? So they have what's called a predatory advantage, which big companies have more products and services to combine so they can build solutions. They face more markets, and they're usually higher situated in the value chain, right? So they usually should be able to just kind of get everybody, but they compete vertically. And the problem with that is, if you do that, smaller, more agile companies, you're easy targets for them.
Especially in those large companies, we talk standardized processes to organize those large amount of crowds in those organizations. What is the challenge in having those processes in place, and then on the other hand being flexible and trying to do some radical and breakthrough innovation where a lot of uncertainties involved?
There's a deeper challenge in what you're saying, and that is, if you think about it for a minute, organizations have two roles. The first role is to stay alive, right? And that means nice quarterly earnings, or if it's a longer term firm, maybe 18 months earnings. And the second is to grow, but staying alive precedes growing. So what happens is organizations develop a lot of process, a lot of mechanisms, a lot of strategies about keeping things within limits, right? This is the middle of the bell curve, if you will. That's what organizations do. Now think about any process, even processes that say they're innovative. Think of TRIZ or any of these things that have multiple steps. It's sort of like a 12-step process getting off of drinking, you know what I mean? Each step is designed to de-risk the process. So what's happening is all of the potential for that innovation premium is being removed from the process. So right off the bat, what organizations have to understand is that the beginning of innovation and the end of innovation, or the long tail, is very different. When you're at the end of innovation and you're trying to get to scale, all of the radical divergence, all the radical variation should be gone by that point. You're trying to get to scale. But at the beginning, none of that should exist. So what happens is organizations love to use tools like portfolio management or stage gating systems, and they constantly say, oh, this is really helping us create more radical innovations. And of course, those are the kind of companies that are easy targets. Look at, for an example, at pharmaceuticals, right? Have you ever seen more brilliant research scientists, their incredible breakthrough miracle drugs not get to market? Because at the very beginning, they're running these systems that are supposed to be run at the end, right? And so one size isn't going to fit all. You have to look at the whole ecosystem as having a very different kind of set of tools at the beginning, the middle, and the end. And most organizations don't get that. They want one size fits all. They have a lot of control issues because they want to show quarterly earnings. And in the end, they set themselves up to be relatively easy prey for people who take a very different track. Again, look at pharmaceuticals and look at what biotechs do to them. Is it that biotechs are smarter? Do they have better people? Do they have more money? No. then how do they get there so quickly? They're running a very different playbook.
What would your proposal be to have some kind of more universal innovation principles across, for large companies?
I would. In fact, I write a lot about this. This has been my whole career. I'm a big believer in heuristics, thinking, patterns of thinking, and recognizing what you're getting. And the reason is we all have blind spots. And there's a term for this that was penned by one of the men who brought me to the University of Michigan, C.K. Prahalad. He called it dominant logic. If you ever talk to anybody about religion or politics, if you ever have, you know what dominant logic is. They can't see anything else. Well, the same is true for innovation. People, they have dominant logic where innovation is a technology, or innovation is money, or innovation is the next cool fashion. So the first thing you have to do is to teach people how to think about innovation. And there's basically three positions. There's the forward position when you start things, high risk, high reward. The middling positions where you have to get it all together, and this is sometimes called the bottom of the bathtub, where innovations lose momentum, it takes longer, you have to platoon players in and out. And then the aft position where you have to sell the stupid thing and you have to get to scale. There are four forces that compete against each other in binary pairs. The first two forces are the create force, and I want you to think about someplace like, I want you to think about Apple in the early days or Genentech in the early days, were just radical, right? But they don't scale very well, do they? And they have a lot of problems with quality. And I want you to think about the opposite. I want you to think about like Toyota or Samsung. I want you to think about companies that are kind of turnkey and they're great at improving, but they don't really get there first. And I want you to think about this tension that goes on between doing something radical that doesn't scale well, that has high risk, and something that's incremental, that scales really well and has low risk. These are not abstract things like, oh, I'm this type and you're that type. Radical innovation destroys quality. It destroys it because it introduces variation. This is the first tension. This is the tension of magnitude, or how much innovation. The second tension is the tension between those kind of Wall Street darling firms. I want you to think about Goldman Sachs and, always making money. The Americans, the ugly Americans, hit first and ask questions later. And the street loves them because they're so fast and they show quarterly earnings, but they're not terribly sustainable. The other side, I want you to think about those kind of newer firms that are more socially oriented. Tom's Shoes. We're gonna put shoes on all the people in Africa who need shoes. Well, they're not really trying to hit quarterly numbers. They're trying to build something that's sustainable. So the first tension is the tension about magnitude. The second is the tension about momentum, or how fast. How much and how fast. And if you've got people around the world, and a lot of companies do this now, right? That if you have companies all around the world and you tell somebody, well, this is a green strategy, all of a sudden you don't have to have a lot of process, a lot of in and out. Everybody knows what the strategy is. So that simple, almost deceptively simple color is a whole combination of strategy and how you hire and what the metrics should be and what kind of projects do you run out of there. But what also happens is everybody understands that the key to innovation is not alignment. The key to innovation is having constructive conflict, having these groups create positive tensions. And the reason, Leonard, is clear. This is where hybrids come from. You ever been to some of these amazing places? I was very lucky that I got to be, in the early days, an advisor to Steve Jobs, and I got to, one of the guys who built Domino's Pizza. One of the things I noticed every place I was in these incredible environments, they were very diverse, and everybody didn't agree. Now, I noticed I didn't say destructive. I said constructive. And this is one of the biggest problems I think enterprise innovators don't get, is that they need enough of that tension to produce something better and new.
Especially about that new part and the breakthrough and radical part of it. Where should that be placed in an organization? And there's no cookie cutter model.
There is no cookie cutter model.
But what are your what have you seen and what have you experienced, and what are the pros and cons, and in which situations could it work well?
There's two parts to that. First of all, I think radical innovation should never be parsed out from everything else, because what happens in these R&D centers is they become orphans. No one knows what's happening. They don't have a line of sight. And all the kind of radical innovators want to hang out with other radical innovators. I live in this little city of Ann Arbor, Michigan, that has more venture capital per person than any city in the world right now. And the problem isn't what goes on in that incubator, that little city of 100,000 people. The problem is, does it relate to everyone else? That's what you want to get to. So the first problem is you can't isolate these people. The remedy is you put them with some dotted line relationship to somebody with a P&L. It has to relate to an end game. We're trying to make something. Now, there's one other thing I'd highly recommend, and that is when an innovation starts, the farther away you can be from the world headquarters, the better off you're going to be because they can't see you. And the closer you get to launching at scale, the closer to the headquarters you can be, the better off you are. And the reason is simple. You want to fail off Broadway and out of sight. You don't want people to see where you're going to fail. What you want is once you have proof of concept and things start to look good, you want to be close enough that you can get the funding and the support that you need to get that project to scale. So what I find our innovators have one of two problems. They either are too close in the beginning and their project is relatively incremental, or they're too far at the end, which means they don't really get the capital they need to get the project to scale.
One thing is always about KPIs and especially in the incremental part of it, there are KPIs around because certainty levels are a lot higher. But especially in the radical and breakthrough part of it and the early stages of it, what KPIs can be used to measure? And large organizations, they love KPIs.
They do. And there is a very false sense of security around KPIs. And I want to lay out what the fundamental problem is. And that is if you start looking at innovation indexes, and any economist will tell you this, they're terribly not predictive. Very few of them ever beat any of the benchmarks, right? So that tells you right off the bat, the smartest people in the world are having trouble getting anything to pay. We can get into that if you want to. But here's the reason. The reason is innovation is what's called a convex form of value. It pays in the future. It doesn't pay now. And we have no data on the future, right? It's an epistemological problem. So if you measure outcomes, but you're not in the future, you're not measuring the future, you're measuring the past. So for example, one of the biggest traps I see organizations do all the time is they're measuring what percentage of revenue came from new products introduced in the last cycle. That tells you a lot about what? About the last cycle. If it predicts the next cycle, it tells you the next cycle is an incremental extension of today's cycle. It has no ability to predict the outlier, right? So what you have to do is look for enablers. Look for cultural affects. Look for indicators of competency. Look for diversity of the pipeline. Look for things that can be correlated to the future, and then most importantly, stress test them. And what that means is if we made the same assumptions that we made at this point in time, which we now have history, and we made them going forward, would it have in fact yielded more than the index would have yielded? And if the answer is no, then you've got the wrong KPI. Make an adjustment. If the answer is yes, then you have to dig deeper and say, what is it about this that makes this work? So KPIs are supposed to be very fluid. It's supposed to be very adjusted. It's not supposed to be something you do once and then you take another lap around the planning cycle.
Now, constructive conflict, and that's really an interesting term, an interesting way of organizing new innovation projects and those dynamics that go along with that. But how do you organize those? And this is really cross-divisional, I guess, and cross-functional. How do you make sure that those teamwork and those conversations are really constructive and not deconstructive?
I think it's twofold. I think, number one, I'm a huge believer in talent. So this is where I kind of get off the reservation from a lot of the organizational development work where everybody can do it. And no, they can't. It's like being a great musician or a great basketball player or a great cook. No, everybody can't do it. I'm sorry, I wish we could. I have this sense of democracy, but and I know it's not true. We learned it when we took piano lessons or when we played basketball or whatever. We learned some people are better. And what happens is when you put highly competent people in the room, now this is important, with other competent people in diverse areas, right? All of a sudden the level of respect goes up. You're going to always have some of that conflict become a little bit caustic, right? That's human nature. Think about any relationship that you have. Is there never a time that you argue, right, where it's not productive? But the notion is what you're trying to do is stay on the right side of that. And what holds people together are really four things. The first thing that holds people together is a shared vision. Are you trying to build something together? Go to the moon, the Large Hadron Collider, you pick it. The second thing that holds people together are goals. What are we trying to accomplish together, right? Third thing that holds people together are values. What do we actually believe? And the final thing that holds people together is process, or the way you work. So whether it's the Beatles or the Fantastic Four or Watson and Crick or Ben and Jerry or Serge and Larry, what you're going to find in any of these situations are people who understand that the conflict is what pulls them forward because it creates this nice positive tension. But also there are times when you have to kind of reel it back in a little bit because it becomes a little too personal.
What is your take on compensation in terms of and incentives when we talk about radical innovation? I mean, when you have a sales team, it's quite easy to compensate them, and there's a lot of history and there's a lot of tangible and quantifiable data to do that. But when you talk about innovation teams, how to compensate them, how to incentivize them?
I wish we could turn the clock back before the 70s when everything became tangible financial compensation. And when you look at great organizations and how they're started, finance is only one very small leg of that chair. There are many things that motivate people. And I think you should look at some other things. For example, people who are in the forward position are motivated by freedom. To give them more freedom, right? Look at the surroundings here in the tech works, a lot of freedom. People who are in the aft position are often motivated by responsibility. They don't get paid more money in the armed forces or the church or things that people have given their life to. They get more responsibility, which they see as a mark of honor. Right? Some people, what they really want is they want to work in a more harmonious community. I want you to think about millennials. Millennials are post-capitalist. You know, they don't work for money. We know that from a number of studies. You know, they don't marry, right? They're having children outside of marriage, so they don't believe in institutions, right? They've opted out of religion, but they have this incredible sense of community and a sense of integrating the community, even though they've opted out of institutions. So they've decided for a life of harmony, right? Where boomers, I'm boomer, and particularly American boomers, we're kind of bare knuckle, we competed for everything. Boomers, the reason what they want is they want some sign of their meritocracy, of their merit. I've beaten you in the competition. So, you know, money is a marker of that, or the, you know, whatever it is in life. Now, the point is, one size doesn't fit all. And so when you think about compensation, don't just think about money. Think about what is it that we can build around you that makes you want to be better and new.
One of important thing in innovation is leadership and leadership capabilities of really leading innovation teams. What is important in terms of leadership?
I think there's a few things. Number one, I think one is being very self-aware of your dominant logic and your bias. It's almost like you're analyzing yourself so that the moves that you make, you realize you're coming from one point of view, and that leads you to the second piece, which is always have trusted advisors who are quite literally the opposite of you. I know my most closely trusted advisor is a man, far more senior than I am. He's almost the opposite of me, and he built one of the largest financial companies in the world. And he knows everything that I'm doing that's wrong. But I listen to him because I know he cares for me, and he's usually right. He sees in my blind spot. The third thing is, if you want to be a great leader, you have to absolutely love talent and people who particularly are not like you. That's the key. Where you're not able to make that play, do you have somebody who can make that play, where you can turn and say, okay, it's your turn. You know, this is something I'm not good at. In my own case, a great example of that is my wife, Stanny, runs the labs. I'm not good at hiring. I'm not good. I look at people and go, he should be able to make this play. I look at talent, but I don't look at whether you're motivated to do it or not. And because over the years you realize, I'm not really good at this, you point to somebody who's good and say, okay, kid, pick me out a winner. So the notion is knowing to turn to someone else. The years of autonomous man, I'm a genius, it came fully formed from my forehead like Athena, those days are over, and those are typically not very good innovation leaders.
You've been talking about some of the in the environment where creative constructive conflict is really good. That was one talent, and really senior talent being in the room. What are other parts and elements that create a good environment for having that constructive conflict?
Three things. Number one, everyone in the world should have someone that they're apprenticed to and someone they apprentice. If you look at dynasties, years ago I got to talk to Sean Fitzpatrick, the former captain of the All Blacks, who have a 97% victory rate right? An international company. They beat everybody for 100 years. And one of the things that they do so well is they have a new person is under the tutelage of someone else, and then when they get to that next level, they tutor someone else. In America, we call this the see one, do one, teach one method of doing things. And what often happens is the person you're apprenticed to is very different than you. So this is not a top-down. This is kind of both bottom-up and top-down. The second thing, when you start looking at what kinds of things can you do, you can start people working on ideas that develop their competency muscles, if you will. So don't put somebody right in the, in the thick of combat right off the bat. Give them something that they can develop some confidence around, some projects that they can feel good about. And then the final thing is, for all leaders, stop taking credit for everybody else's work, right? What you need to do is to say, these guys did this. And it's a really hard thing for some people, but the notion is even if you really did create it, say you didn't, right? Because what you're doing is you're trying to build an inner circle. And even if you're not the senior person, remember, you don't boil the ocean. What you're trying to do is develop a small group of people around you, and those people have to become highly practiced. People don't get to the top and they don't innovate individually. They do in small groups.
Jeff, last question. You have a lot of experience down the line with large companies and innovation, and then also in research. How do you see the development within innovation, looking back 20 years and then to today? What changed? And maybe, I know the future is always difficult. What would your projections be? And
I have to say, when I have a PhD in an area that would eventually grow into artificial intelligence. I don't have a business PhD. And I did something outrageous. I went to work, I turned down a job for the National Institutes of Health, creating computer-based training for doctors. And I took a job to work for a man with a pizza company. And one of the first things that we did at Domino's Pizza, which grew at 300% a year for the 5 years I was there, was we basically got rid of the walls, we got rid of the hierarchy, and we went to what everybody's doing today. That's going back to 1985. That's how old it was. And then I was on a group at Apple called Applied Integrated Systems. This is where I got to meet Steve Jobs. And what I learned from Applied Integrated Systems is this is where the notion where they had to open up the software platform to have value-added resellers put software on because they couldn't compete with Microsoft. So this is the beginning of apps. This is the beginning of the ecosystem that becomes iTunes. So what I learned very early on was that innovation was a very horizontal piece, and that what made innovation could happen anywhere along the value chain. That's what I learned. Everyone's kind of got that now. That's what sprints are all about, and finally, thank God we finally caught up. I think the next frontier is different. I think the next frontier has a few different elements to it. The first element to it is data. Right? There's massive amounts of data, and everybody thinks that's the answer. Now, this is getting closer to the field I came from. And the answer is it's not about data, it's about sense making. What does it mean? What does it mean? The logical continuation of high density throughput is easy, right? A computer can do that for you. It can read an MRI. It's the interesting data point that goes off to the edge that has to have sense making. So we're going to have to dig a lot deeper and go a lot farther out, particularly I am, to make sense of what these big data patterns tell us. The second thing is, which I think is related, is artificial intelligence. What is it that we're not seeing in the patterns that the artificial intelligence can see? And what's really happening is derivative work, particularly in like healthcare and places like that. It's only a matter of time before the machines do 90% of that work. And it's moving from transactional all the way translational. We could talk about this some other time, but the notion is it used to be like phone operators, and now think about it. The largest legal firm in the United States is LegalZoom. It's now, robo lawyers, right? They have some real ones too, but I mean the whole model is kind of a template model. And then the final thing I think is the issue of the divide between reality and the digital domain is disappearing. And if you think about virtual reality, or you think about how you make something on your computer right now, and all of a sudden it makes something significant, people are talking about 3D printing like it's making a bottle. I want you to think about what Boeing is doing with 3D printing, where they are making customized airplanes, customized jets with composite materials, and they're eliminating the manufacturing step. They're actually manufacturing turbos and, and tensor steel and carbonite and all this kind of stuff, and they're doing it with what, 1 million moving parts, and they're doing it in short periods of time. So the whole cycle between, oh, I've got this, idea, and it's both wonderful. Think about all the things we could do in the world. And it's also scary. Think about megalomaniacs and all the crap that they could build with this relatively quickly. So I think it's data, AI, and sort of this collapse of the digital and the physical domain. I think that's where it's going to go towards the what's ever left of my career. I think at the end of the day, it's still going to come down to two things. It's going to come down to talented and imaginative people, right, which is the first one. And it's going to come down to making sense out of things that seem very incongruous to us. And those opportunities, I don't think, ever go away. I think that's human nature. And thank goodness that's what's promising about our ability to make the world better and new.
Jeff, thank you very much for that interesting and pleasant conversation.
Thank you, Leonard. Thanks for having me.